You're listening to Brave Girls with Tracy M., where we choose to empower you to be a better leader, mentor, and coach in the world. We'll share stories of people who have achieved great heights by overcoming adversity and rising to the challenge, all while pursuing their passions. These courageous people will inspire you to have faith in yourself and take bold action. Right here with the host of Brave Girls, Tracy M.
Episode 61, Reach Out with Wendy Meyeroff. Fellow business communications leader and podcaster Wendy Meyeroff joins us today on the show to share her Brave Girl journey and her advice for other women. Coming from a family of storytellers, Wendy naturally excelled at writing and easily won a scholarship for college in New York. She started her career at a publishing house upon graduation and has continued to use her talents to educate and inform others about a variety of topics. She has had an interesting career as a writer, working in several industries in both the B2B and B2C space. She's written extensively in the healthcare space, specifically regarding the senior population. Her gift is simply stated in putting complex technical information into plain English for patient education. She uses storytelling to make it interesting for consumers to grasp and understand. A continuous learner, Wendy's always educating herself on technology, marketing techniques, and more, and she encourages you to do the same. Wendy also shares her very personal health journey with epilepsy and what she's learned as a result. She shares with me the stigma around speaking publicly about epilepsy, a condition that not only affects her, but 3 million other Americans. In 2014, she had surgery on her brain and is doing well as a result. Wendy felt compelled to speak about her condition on the show in hopes of helping others see the value in reaching out when you face something of this magnitude. She also shares her best advice if you have a family member or friend impacted by this condition. A true warrior, Wendy continues to rally, be brave, speak up, and move forward on her life journey. I know you'll love this episode as much as I loved it recording it. So let's go and find out from Wendy Meyeroff why you always need to reach out.
So welcome to Brave Girls with Tracy M. I'm so excited because tonight we have a fellow marketing and communications guru, Wendy Meyeroff, who owns WM Medical Communications. So she's the president, and she's also the business anchor of the Partners in Health and Business podcast. So welcome to the show, Wendy.
Hi, Tracy. It's so great to be here.
Yeah, so we met online a few years ago, and I came to know you as someone that's very expert in writing business materials on the clinical side and the patient and consumer-oriented side around health issues. And you also have a special kind of skill as well as area of expertise, I would say, in writing about issues for and about aging Americans. And today, as I know it, there's 10,000 Americans every single day that are turning 65. And so that's a lot of people that are in your target audience. So talk a little bit more about that.
Well, I started writing about aging Americans, and I guess I got it from watching my mother and probably the lady I almost call my second mother, my Aunt Tilly, my father's oldest sister. And they were both the main caregivers. Tilly's mother, my grandmother, lived right downstairs. They had a mother-daughter house. My mother was an hour and a half away from Grandma in California, and she was the typical sandwich generation where she was holding a full-time job, not because back in those days she was dying to have a career. She did it as a second income earner. And guess who's schlepping out, to use the clinical term? You see how I know so much clinical speak? Schlepping out to New Jersey, an hour and a half each way. And at first, Grandma didn't need her very often. But it became more, and not just for the shopping, but getting her to doctors. And I was watching all this going on. It finally, my sister and I had already left home. I was married. My sister Marla was in California. So Mom convinced Dad to sell the family home in Brooklyn, which broke his heart. And she moved a little closer. She didn't go right on top of where Grandma was living because they weren't that well connected. But she was the daughter, so she had the responsibility. It usually ends up on the females in the family. And so she was about then a half hour away, but she was still schlepping into work. She had to drive over to the train station. At least you could go from Jersey into Lower Manhattan by Amtrak. And, you get older, you're in your 50s, you're not spring chicken anymore. And my mother was the kind, she'd get down on her knees and vacuum everything and lift everything. And she was pooped. And I watched how tough this was. And I fell into writing stories. And as you mentioned, I was sort of on the clinical side. I know 12-syllable words, and I wrote for the neuroscience newsletter of New York Presbyterian. But I'm more of a business to business. I'll talk to the clinicians or the sales reps or the HR people and get the business oriented sides, like the pros and cons of being a rural doctor, or what it takes to hire and fire your personnel. And I even wrote some of the stories when we were getting first. A lot of your younger listeners are not going to know this, but when we were first talking about managed care and the information superhighway. So I got involved very early on the business side, but I'd grown up watching my mother read Good Housekeeping and Family Circle. And so if you ask any writer, especially us nonfiction folks, they'll tell you, oh, I've always wanted to be in, and fill in the blank of the magazine.
Right.
We've been taught succeeding as a magazine writer and say, you can't always start with Smithsonian or Discover or whatever your favorite is. Mine was Good Housekeeping and those women's magazines. And little by little, I got onto the consumer side, because unlike a lot of medical, quote unquote, writers, I can write in plain English. And in fact, I've now belonged to the Center for Plain Language. So whether we're health writers, legal writers, science writers, you geek speak translators. And so I just started writing about things, and I got from stories in Good Housekeeping, and then I got to be the health writer for Senior Wire News Syndicate, which was distributed all across the country and became one of the first websites. And because I had the web experience, I got called by CBS was launching its first website for consumers, which has not lasted, but I was part of the team. And it is just such fun. And that's what sort of dragged me onto the senior side. You'll see my website, and it has something about Savvy Scribe for seniors or something like that.
Right.
And it's not my end all and be all. It's not the only work I've covered, but without a doubt, it's closest to my heart. And now you finally see senior ads. Everybody can buy their urinary incontinence pad, and everybody can get an erectile dysfunction drug, and it's the cell phone specifically for seniors and all this sort. But that's only about the last 5 years.
Yes.
I'm amazed at the difference from when I started 20 years ago, and even 10 years ago. You and I discussed working at different points in time for one of the retirement groups. And when I wrote about PTSD in older vets, and I wrote about breast cancer in older women, because most people don't know the 1 in 8 number for breast cancer applies when we hit 80. We don't know it's not the average number. Doesn't mean you shouldn't, you should dismiss it, because I think it's like 1 in 40 or something when we hit middle age. So I don't want any of your listeners to skip out on their mammograms or anything. But we don't talk about older health. And this was groundbreaking stuff, and I adore it.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's taking that gobbledygook and breaking it down so that you can put it in plain language. And that's a skill. That is definitely a gift and a skill.
It's only getting appreciated now. I used to belong to a medical writing group, and they dismissed direct-to-consumer drugs were exploding, where it's an RX and you could ask the doctor to tell you all about it, where instead of just writing the prescription. We now have more of our own authority, so to speak, of demanding the doctor give us this med or don't recommend this surgery. And patient education is crept up, but we didn't cover it many years ago. And I was just at a meeting last November in DC, and there were 2 leaders from NIH that did a seminar on storytelling. And whether you're talking to the other clinicians and you tell it as a story, so it's fascinating of how you got this research done. And certainly if you're talking to consumers, and I once was interviewed by a PhD who's a leader in the medical, clinical writing stuff, but she was totally flummoxed when she heard the different levels of lay language. Because 1 minute I'm writing for a CEO to understand, let's say, a new type of sugar substitute. And the next minute I'm talking, I just finished a project. And all I can tell you about it, it was taking highly clinical sentences and turning it into 5th grade English. I was part of this team. Mm-hmm. Imagine, it's not as easy as people think it is.
Right, right. But it's important that the gobbledygook and the, complex sentences and the science gets translated, because you're like a translator, essentially.
Yes. I used to call it the technical translator instead of WM Medical Communications, but my colleagues emailed me and said, people could think you're turning it in from English into French or Spanish. Or taking it out of that language. So I said, yeah, I think I'll just stick to WM Medical Communications.
Right. And so on your journey as an entrepreneur, what is kind of one of your favorite things? Is it the thrill of getting that new project and being involved in those teams and those types of things?
It's learning something different every time I turn around. I mean, I started strictly in print materials and especially magazine articles. Then it went to newsletters, so you had to be able to shorten the stories. Then it went to case studies and white paper type things. So now the stories are even longer very often because they're 8,000 words and you're talking strictly on the business side. And then I became, as I mentioned, one of the first to go online. So, and we didn't know with websites originally how long we could do it because it doesn't have a page count and it doesn't have space issues. Mm-hmm. So if we put 1,500 words up on the internet, who cared? Well, now there's a pro and con with that now. Do we break it into 2 stories and blog it? Because what they're calling custom content is what I've been doing for 20 years. Every story, every newsletter, e-newsletters, one-page newsletters, all these kinds of things, webinars. I did a very early on webinar, and I said to the sponsors, well, if I interviewed the panel that's doing the discussion, you'll have a handout for people who can't get to the webinar. Not everybody can tune in, even if it is noon or lunchtime or whatever. Right. So, oh, yes, that would be good.
Right.
It's different every time, even if you've done 20 webinars or 4,000 features. Everyone has a different focus, and it's fun. I learn something new every time I turn around.
That's great. Now, did you go to school in New York to learn how to be a writer?
I did go to school in New York. I went to college. But I'll be honest with you, I wasn't sure why the heck I was going to college, except the fact that I was the first one in my immediate family. Mm-hmm. And I accidentally won a Regents scholarship. It was the most hysterical thing ever. I go with a friend who was insisted on getting possibly the scholarship. I didn't study, I just went. And so we had an English part of the test and the math test. And how I passed the math test, God only knows. That's not my side of the brain, Don't come from that part of the family. And a few weeks later, we get the notices, and I couldn't read mine because it got printed badly. And I'm looking at this, and I hand it to my friend. I said, what the heck does that say? And she screamed, you won! You won a scholarship! So, and it covered everything I needed, so how could I turn my family down? And I went to school, and I knew I loved English, and I had fun classes, the origins of the English language, and all sorts of stuff. So technically, I really wasn't trained as a journalist, but I think it's because I come from a family of storytellers.
Yes.
Between puns and made-up words, and my Aunt Tilly, God rest her, she would tell us stories. Well, I'm feeding Kitty the ketchup if you want to come for lunch, and Benny the bird will be visiting, and you'll be having sauteed shoelaces and fried corset, but it's very wonderful. So, did I grow up with stories? So even though I'm not a fiction person, I was reading at 12th grade level in 6th grade because I got
Right.
exposed to all of this, and it was fun. And I get out of school, and I happened to get married early in life, and we're married 6 months, and I'm trying to redecorate this and do that. And he says, and he was making a nice living, but he said, well, you want more? Get a job. And I fell into a publishing house, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Wow. Wow. That's great. So I kind of want to pivot and talk a little bit about your personal story in terms of when you learned that you had a condition.
Well, we're not hiding the condition totally.
Okay.
What happened, the way I learned the story is at age 3, I spiked 106 fever.
Okay.
Now, we worry about kids with 101 or 103, so try 106.
Mm-hmm.
And I went into what they call febrile or fever-related convulsions.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this happens with high fevers, and most kids come out of it, and there's no real issue. Well, I started having seizures.
Mm-hmm.
And they put me on med, and they weaned me off med. And this went back and forth till I was 13. And that's when I really found out sort of what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
I wake up one Saturday morning. My parents had bought their first home. I am not a do-it-yourselfer. But my whole family, the rest of them, oh, we're painting, we're wallpapering, we're daddy's doing carpentry. Oh, Lord almighty. So I was thrilled this particular Saturday because we were going to a special event and not doing the DIY. Couldn't get my head off the pillow. Next thing I know, my mother's looking down at me, and I still sort of tired, but I say, well, are we going? And I said, I don't hear Marla, my younger sister, or Dad around. She says, Wendy, Marla's at work, at school, and Daddy's at work. I said, on a Saturday? She said, Wendy, this is Monday. Mm. And apparently, we had a doctor, God bless him, who made house calls, and he'd come and he tested me. Do you know your name and what day it is? Or do you know who the president of the United States is? 2 days later, I get to a regular doctor, full visit, and they say, well, you have convulsions. They still wouldn't say seizures, let alone epilepsy. And the one thing I remember most of all from that, one of the rules, and people with epilepsy, they have 12,000, violations or things they shouldn't do. Don't drive a car. Don't take baths because you could drown in the bathtub. Take a shower if you have to. Well, obviously you have to. Don't cook. Don't do anything at all, practically. Don't play sports. Don't.
Right.
So the only rule I heard really was don't climb ladders. Mm-hmm. Now this turned out, I thought, to be great because the next weekend, and I've started a new medicine, and those medicines, especially the older ones, they could make you dizzy and banging into things. I tripped and fell most of my young life. Mm-hmm. Every time, it could be a straight line, I fell over it. So my father is getting the new bunch of wallpaper up, and he hands me a strip and says, here, go up the ladder. And I'm halfway up, and I hear the doctor's voice in my head, and I say, oh, but Daddy, I shouldn't be climbing ladders. And he says, you're healthier than I am. Get up there. Mm-hmm. And that was a major advantage I had as a youngster. On the one hand, they sort of worked around it and pretended there was almost nothing wrong. So they didn't listen when I said, I'm still nauseous. I don't feel well or whatever. Oh, don't worry. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, I was allowed on the playground. I rode a bike. I roller skated. Mm-hmm. Not well. I always had bad balance issues. So it's not good at it. My mother, I found out years later, tore up the stuff that was going to put me into special ed.
Right.
I wasn't dumb. Yes,
right.
I had a brain issue, but I wasn't dumb in any way, shape, or form. Mm-hmm. She wouldn't let me be kept out of phys ed class. Mm-hmm. And some of it I did well, and some of it, I ain't going to become a gymnastics star. Mm-hmm. No, not my sort of thing. So it wasn't until I was 13 I had any sense of all.
Right.
And it wasn't until I was 21 and nearly died that I heard the word epilepsy.
Right, right. And so you indicated that you had brain surgery at one point. When did that happen?
That was, I'm about to have my 5th anniversary this year. It was
Oh,
2014.
okay.
But things got really sketchy a few years earlier in 2010.
Mm-hmm.
Because most of my life, I was fairly well controlled. Were there incidents hither and yon? Yes. But
Mm-hmm.
I came through most of life, obviously. Okay, I graduated magna
Right.
cum laude. I found a guy willing to marry me when he found out what had happened.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been with him forever.
Mm-hmm.
He's still here, thank
Congratulations.
God. And it did help that he was in the medical corps in the military and he saw active service. So anytime I really went down, he knew what was going on.
Yeah.
So there I am in 2010 and things start escalating. And we don't know why. You
Oh,
know,
okay.
medicine can wear off. Could I be
Right.
going through the change and that if the hormones of just the plain stress, because as you know, in '09, the market crashed, and I, like a
Yes.
lot of others, were forced out of the job I had,
Yes.
but I was a contractor.
Yes.
My husband and I had already been destroyed by 9/11, so now we're back in poverty and no
Yes.
benefits, no unemployment, nothing. Both
Yep.
too old to hire, of course, so the
Right.
government will tell you there's no age discrimination. Okay. So my seizures escalated. And the first thing that happened in 2010 is I was cooking no less a healthy meal. I was grilling tofu on the indoor stove. And the next thing I know, I'm crawling out, and 2 fingers are totally black. And the
Mm.
ex-Army guy gets me to the hospital. The first hospital does exactly the wrong thing. I warn your listeners, do not put ice on any type of burn, even the mild burn.
Right.
Little warm water for a mild burn. If you have aloe vera in the house as a cream, that's really good, or Neosporin in the bandage. But once it starts getting black, you're in trouble.
Right.
And the second and third fingers were pitch black. And
Mm.
ultimately, when they got, hubby dragged me over to the Bayview Burn Center of Hopkins because
Mm-hmm.
the first hospital wasn't doing a darn thing.
Right.
So he got me dressed up and dragged over there. And they took one look and they said, uh-oh. And they partially amputated one finger,
Mm-hmm.
which is in pain 24/7.
Mm-hmm.
And the other one they saved, the middle finger is there, but it's just a straight board, essentially, even with the
Mm-hmm.
grafting that they could do. But I got back to work.
Mm-hmm.
But then the seizures kept getting worse and worse, more
Mm-hmm.
frequent. So the health reporter here,
Mm-hmm.
I'd heard from my neuro specialist, and I've been blessed to have an epilepsy specialist. There
Mm-hmm.
aren't too many of them around.
Right.
I urge your listeners, if you have any conditions, just like oncology, if you have prostate cancer, you're not going to go to a breast cancer
Right.
specialist.
Right.
Well, same thing. If you have multiple sclerosis, if you have Parkinson's or whatever, you try and find a doctor who knows this kind of thing.
Right.
So I've been very blessed with most of the doctors I had once I started asking questions as an adult.
Right.
And so the guy I was with said, there's nothing more I can do. I've upped your medicine as much as I can. There's nothing new coming out.
Right.
You either have to live with it this way, or are you brave enough to explore brain surgery?
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't even hesitate. And I did my research, helps
Yep.
a reporter.
Yep.
There's
Yep.
a great site called clinicaltrials.gov, which is complex to understand. But at least if you type in, let's say, chronic fatigue syndrome and Baltimore, it'll tell you if there are and where any trials at all, whether they're in Baltimore proper, or they might even steer you to Annapolis or wherever is the closest one.
Right.
And much to my amazement, there was a surgery for what's called front temporal lobe.
Mm-hmm.
Front part of your left side of the brain. And that's where my scar tissue was that they found when they could do MRIs and CAT scans and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't just welcome me in. They don't do that at NIH, National Institutes of Health, one of the greatest and most undervalued medical institutions in this country. Their funding constantly gets cut, but these people do wondrous things. They've got one division for diabetes. There's the National Institute on Aging that I adore. But of course, I love the neuro division.
Right.
And you get very, very personalized care. They only take X number of patients at a time.
Right.
And, you might be the 2 Parkinson's patients, you might be the 2 with essential tremor or whatever.
Right.
So went through 3 different interviews, went through all sorts of tests, because since they were doing a study, they tested me before on things like memory and organization and other things. I now have a good excuse for being terrible at organizing things. I put up a file on my computer, forget where I put it, then I put it someplace else. This drives my husband, the computer maven, absolutely bananas. I wish the home office was as neatly organized as I know I could get it, but I now have a good excuse. I don't have good organizational skills in my brain. So, okay, and they did the surgery, and I will tell you honestly, Tracy, the first year was heck, to put it politely.
Yeah, I'm sure. That's
It
tough.
was my communication side. I said to the doctors, couldn't you take out the math section? It's no good anyway. And he said, no, your scars
Right.
on the side.
Right.
And for almost a year, my communication skills went into the hamper or whatever.
Right.
You wouldn't believe it the way you hear me talk, but I couldn't think of words like chair. I could remember triskaidekaphobia for some reason. I couldn't remember the word chair. And so it's taken me more than a year. And when you run your own business and you can't handle it yourself, and I urge women everywhere, when you are doing this kind of thing, whether you're first getting started or you've been at it forever, make sure you find backup help. Because after I confessed to all this to my editorial group, they said, if you told us you were going for surgery, we would have filled in for you. And you give them either they collect all of it and give you part of it, or like a commission type thing.
Exactly.
But you work out arrangements.
Yes.
And we have to do that, whether it's bad weather. I've been in contact with folks. Are you all right with the craziness out in California? Or wherever. So when we can help each other and to reach out.
Yes.
It doesn't have to be brain surgery.
Right. Well, now have you actually written articles about epilepsy?
I have written a few, because this is one of the hardest things to get talked about in this country. I think I emailed you and I said,
I was going to say why. Why is that? Because I wasn't aware of that.
Oh yeah, I call it America's last stigma. Because think about it. As you and I record this, it's the Monday right after it's the Thursday rather, right after the Oscars. And on Monday, they did a special report on a young actress who's developed MS. And she went to the Oscars with a specially designed, glorious-looking cane. And then she did an interview with one of the ABC News leaders about coping with MS. We just heard today, you and I talk about this, that the guy from Beverly Hills 90210 has had a stroke, apparently. And I've just forgotten his name. So we can talk Alzheimer's. We can talk depression. We have celebrities who admit to who know about schizophrenia. Of course, Michael J. Fox launched the issue with Parkinson's and had Oprah. And after he was on Oprah, I wrote to her and said, well, why not epilepsy? Because I'll tell you honestly, Tracy, until Alzheimer's eclipsed it, this has been the leading neuro disorder in the country. There are 3 million of us with epilepsy. There's 1.5 million with Parkinson's. There's about 10 times more of us with epilepsy than with multiple sclerosis, and 100 times more than Lou Gehrig's disease, ALS. Now, this is not to dismiss any of them. We want to cure and properly treat all of them. And everybody has to be able, just like I found my neuro specialist, find the right doctors and find support groups and whatever it needs, find articles. But this epilepsy you can't talk about in polite company. I'm amazed I'm willing to talk to you about it, and it's taken me most of my life, and mainly because I've been cured. I don't have to hide it really anymore.
So let me ask you this. So if I have family or friends that do have this condition, what should I be doing? What should I be doing
Well,
as a patient advocate?
It depends on what they want to do. You can't force them to do anything, obviously. And I get this all the time. It's amazing. I was at the library, and our Pikesville library upstairs is a senior center. And I was getting some info for hubby, because I hadn't quite gotten to the senior yet. And I don't remember what the heck brought it up, but I mentioned something about epilepsy, and the woman next to me almost screams in the library, "You know about this? You've had surgery? My son-in-law is going for tests tomorrow. Please, please tell me, help me." So every other person you talk to either has epilepsy, knows somebody with epilepsy, or knew somebody. You know, their teacher, their mailman fell down in front of them, something.
Right.
So the thing is, it depends on, first of all, if your loved one has gotten any help yet.
Right.
So far.
Yeah. So that's the number one thing.
So where are they located? Is there any specialized doctors around?
Right.
So you could type in epilepsy specialist, or, you know, epilepsy physicians in Louisville, Kentucky, or wherever.
Right.
And you should be able to get a list. And I suggest finding the major medical centers, whether it's at Duke University, and NYU, at Hopkins, or wherever. My doctor just happens to be at Sinai, which does not get as much publicity, but it has the most amazing brain and spine institute.
Right.
Perry Foreman is his name. And don't call him because he's already too busy.
Right.
And I want to be able to get in to see him. But, you know, so you find out, and you have to see if your loved one will talk about it, because a lot of people are still in hiding, or they've been like I got patted on the head, don't worry. We know that many people with epilepsy are misdiagnosed. And in fact, you asked about articles. One of my favorite articles, and it goes back a ways, but it's one of the few I was allowed to write, and it was epilepsy being dementia, being mistaken. All right. People think that you have dementia and you're really having small seizures.
Okay.
Not every seizure is falling down on the floor like we see on TV.
Right.
It can be someone stuttering. It could be, they've told me I would stare off into space and stop dead in my tracks speaking. But, you know, you can disguise that and say, well, I was thinking about our business issue and just lost track. Or they say I would start chattering my teeth or shaking in small ways. So, and it would vary. So a seizure can be a few seconds. It could be a couple of minutes, and it's not always falling down on the floor and thrashing and saliva. So it's very tricky.
Right.
So, you know, you have to figure out, has your loved one been diagnosed? Is this just a suspicion? And if they're older, they may not be willing to talk about it. They could still be very embarrassed.
Correct. Or in denial.
Yeah, well, it's like any other condition. Oh, this really isn't bothering me. So whether it's chronic fatigue.
Right.
I still remember the Golden Girls episode where Dorothy kept trying to get up and get to work and whatever. And she tried to get a doctor to understand. And they were going, oh, you don't really have a problem. And I think, honestly, we women have special issues, just like with heart disease, where we don't get diagnosed properly so often. Here we are in the 21st century. Women's lib was long ago, not that we should ever be giving it up. And we women, if a guy comes in and talks about a certain type of pain or issue or sleepiness or whatever, doctor listens. But we still have issues. And again, it depends on the part of the country you're in.
Yes.
Do you have good specialists? I remember being taught a few years ago, I was doing some work and I was talking to a leader of the Alzheimer's Association. And they were first trying to get the word out about early onset Alzheimer's. And so he gave me his nice 5-minute reporter spiel. And he said, of course, he says, so do you have any questions? And I said, well, you know, I love what you had to say, because he was suggesting that primary doctors should be looking for certain symptoms without getting into what the symptoms were. And I said, well, is the association going to be training our primaries in this? And how are they going to have the time? Because the medical association swears their primaries have maybe 15 minutes full. And that's to do your blood pressure and listen to your heart and maybe even do an EKG and take your blood and so forth. How are they going to get into discussions about forgetfulness or whatever else? And he's going, oh, gee, yeah, that's a good question. So who are we training and how? So it's a very challenging issue. It took me 30 years before I found the right doctor back in New York at NYU. And then, as I say, I was blessed to find the Sinai doctor. But that took some testing when I got down here. It took me almost a decade before I found Perry Foreman at Sinai. And you got plenty of gorgeous, wonderful hospitals in the Baltimore area. It's not like they're not around. So it just, and you know, part of it is not just how much your doctor knows, but can you get along with this person?
So my finale question is always, what's the bravest thing that you've ever done, and how does it inspire you today? And you've been through a lot.
Yeah.
A lot. And so I'm sure you've had many brave moments in your life, and even some within the last 5 years. So when you really think back, what is that bravest thing that you've ever done?
So the other, I guess the bravest thing I did was get married. And I was so lucky. I've been so lucky, because he's been through heck, not just with the seizures, but all the other health issues that come around with it. And I lived a life of total fear and anxiety, and in some ways depression. They've linked depression and epilepsy. We don't know if the seizures cause the depression. If the depression helps cause more seizures, they're probably interrelated. And to be willing to go forward with somebody, I was sure he would leave me. And God bless, he's still here. So I urge people, don't give up, whether it's epilepsy or any other chronic condition, and especially the ones we don't talk about as much or we keep dismissing. Get help, find help. We're so blessed. When you look, it is true. You seek and ye shall find. I believe it is true. And I'm so lucky to talk to people like you and other colleagues and other women, not just women though. You know, reach out to whoever can be your guiding star.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your clinical knowledge, as well as your personal story. And I think a lot of what you've said will resonate with our audience, and it's going to be something that you've said that is exactly what someone needed to hear while they listen to this podcast. And so I love your message of reaching out. I love your message about getting backup help. Thank you for also educating us about epilepsy and, what it means to have a neurodisorder in this country. And I think you are fortunate that you were able to get exactly who you needed to be with in terms of this doctor, and that you had the courage to do the brain surgery and to allow your body to heal for the year that I'm sure it took for you to heal. But thank you so much, Wendy, for being you and for coming on the show. And now if people want to get in touch with you, what's the best way to find them?
Well, whether you want to be a guest or a sponsor on the Partners in Health and Biz podcast, or whether you just need my brilliance for reaching the business side in health communications and other senior issues, senior living, you want the senior scribe, you can contact me both ways. You can look up Wendy Meyeroff, of course, on LinkedIn. You can find my WM Medical Communications, which is at WMMedcom, COMM.com. And you can always email me. I dealt with people around the country and around the world just from my glorious computer, even when we were just doing it on the phone, let alone with Skype or whatever. So you reach me at WJ, and the last name is Meyeroff, MEYEROFF like Frank, @gmail.com.
Perfect. Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you, Tracy. It's been fun. So you enjoy, and we will talk again, I know.
Yes.
You come on the podcast.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of Brave Girls with Tracy M. as much as I did creating it. Each show is produced with you, the listener, in mind, as you look for inspiration and motivation from other brave souls as you pursue your desires. I'd love to hear your feedback, so please leave me a review on iTunes. I read every one. And check out my website, tracym.com, for more free resources. You can also join my list and sign up for my newsletter right from the homepage. Until next time, stay strong, believe in your dreams, and go do something brave.
We appreciate you joining us for this episode of Brave Girls with Tracy M. and hope that you enjoyed the show. For more information about today's episode, as well as additional free resources to help you achieve greatness in your life, visit tracym.com and sign up for our mailing list. Until next time, dream big, believe in yourself, and let your brilliance shine as only you can do.